The 70s produced a specific kind of film that an entire generation caught on late-night cable and weekend rentals and has collectively agreed not to bring up. These are the ones that quietly became the blueprint for everything Hollywood has been making ever since, which is the part nobody is ready to admit. Before she became Wonder Woman, Lynda Carter made the only film she has ever genuinely tried to make disappear. Bobby Joe and the Outlaw is a drive-in crime spree movie where the future Wonder Woman films scenes that her future costume would never allow, shoots people, and falls in love with a man who genuinely believes he is Billy the Kid, and the only reason it exists is that Carter needed the work while waiting to hear whether the Wonder Woman pilot had been picked up by CBS. The film pairs her with Marjoe Gortner, a former fraudulent child evangelist whose childhood ministry had already made him the subject of a documentary expose, and together they deliver exactly the kind of unhinged, sweaty, low-budget chaos that made the grindhouse circuit worth showing up to in the first place. The film grossed roughly $5 million on a $500,000 investment, and when Wonder Woman launched just months later and turned Carter into a national role model for young girls, the exploitation label attached to Bobby Joe became a PR crisis she managed for the better part of a decade, and when she eventually disowned it, the Wonder Woman posters stayed up anyway. David Zucker, Jim Abrahams, and Jerry Zucker spent years trying to convince a studio that a feature film with no plot, no central character, and sketches including a fake Catholic schoolgirl exploitation trailer and a kung fu parody could work as a theatrical release. And every single one of them said no, so they raised $650,000 from a real estate developer who had never read a script before and made it themselves in 23 days. Kentucky Fried Movie is a rapid-fire anthology of parody sketches, and John Landis shot the Enter the Dragon spoof on actual 35mm film stock because it needed to look exactly like the thing it was mocking, nearly bankrupting the production in the process. The film's villain was played by Han Bong-soo, an actual Hapkido grandmaster who used his ad-libbed Korean dialogue to spend his entire screen time screaming about how deplorable the movie was and lamenting what it meant for a serious martial artist to be standing there, which Landis approved because he assumed American audiences would just hear menacing foreign speech. When the film grossed over $15 million, a Universal executive's assistant saw it in theaters and immediately recommended John Landis to direct National Lampoon's Animal House, and the ZAZ team went on to make Airplane and The Naked Gun. A fake exploitation trailer got the film banned in several Midwest counties by theater owners who were convinced they were screening an adult film, and while that part was accidental, a $650,000 film rewriting the entire decade of American comedy was not. Howard Zeem realized partway through making Flesh Gordon that he might go to prison for what he had already filmed, and his solution was one of the stranger legal maneuvers in Hollywood history. Flesh Gordon is a space comedy where the villain is named Emperor Wong the Perverted. The hero's rocket ship has a shape that requires no further description, and the planet Earth is being attacked by rays that make everyone lose control of their most basic impulses. And it started out as a full adult film before Zeem noticed the stop-motion effects were good enough to earn a mainstream theatrical release. He and his co-director handed all the explicit footage directly to the Los Angeles Police Department Vice Squad as proof they were cleaning up the production, and the seams of that decision are still visible in scenes where the actors' positions don't quite line up, permanent evidence of the film they abandoned halfway through making. Rick Baker and Greg Jean, both of whom went on to win Academy Awards for entirely different work, treated the stop-motion sequences with complete seriousness regardless of what was happening around them. The film grossed roughly $20 million on a $250,000 budget, and when Dino De Laurentiis released his serious Flash Gordon adaptation 6 years later, he reportedly complained that audiences kept confusing the two. Universal gave John Belushi somewhere between $35,000 and $50,000 to anchor what became one of the most profitable comedies in Hollywood history, and the number never stopped being the central insult of his career. Animal House is a film where a man eats an entire cafeteria while making sound effects, a horse dies of a heart attack inside a dean's office, and a parade gets destroyed by a fake parade, and the studio's entire pitch to get it made was that it would be cheap. Director John Landis stripped most of Belushi's scripted dialogue during production because he realized Bluto was funnier doing nothing than anything written for him, while Belushi was simultaneously commuting between the Oregon set and New York every week to film Saturday Night Live. The University of Missouri called the script uniquely filthy and withdrew. The University of Oregon agreed without reading it and accepted $20,000 for the location, and the film grossed $141 million and became one of the most successful raunchy comedies ever made, with Belushi paid only $50,000 despite being the reason most of it worked. A year before Rocky made him the most famous actor in America, Sylvester Stallone was being paid $700 a week to play second fiddle in a Roger Corman film he felt was beneath him and was constantly rewriting to make himself look better. Death Race 2000 is a film where drivers earn points by running over pedestrians during a government-sanctioned cross-country race. Senior citizens and infants are worth the most points, and the crowd cheers for every hit, and Roger Corman got this into wide theatrical release in 1975 without anyone stopping him. Peter Fonda had been Corman's first choice for the lead, read the script, and passed on the grounds that it was too ridiculous to make. Director Paul Bartel said afterward that Corman ripped out most of his comedy scenes before release and replaced them with crushed heads and blood squibs, which is a reasonable description of what Corman did to every director who ever worked for him. The film inspired a 1976 arcade game that became the first video game to trigger national protests, civic organization campaigns, and a 60-minute segment on whether games were destroying American children, making it the only Roger Corman production to accidentally launch an entirely new moral panic. Corman re-released the film with Stallone's name at the top after Rocky won the Oscar, turned the $300,000 production into an $8 million windfall, and won the lawsuit Stallone filed to stop him, which is a perfect encapsulation of working for Roger Corman. Roger Ebert wrote the screenplay for Beyond the Valley of the Dolls in a 6-week stretch with Russ Meyer, and then spent most of his career being mocked for it by people who hadn't watched it carefully enough to understand what they were mocking. The film follows an all-girl rock band through a version of late 60s Hollywood so completely unhinged that it builds from psychedelic pool parties and Z-Man hosting gatherings in his mansion to a sword-wielding massacre that leaves half the cast dead, and 20th Century Fox approved and financed the entire thing because they were desperate enough to give Russ Meyer total creative freedom. When the MPAA gave the finished film an X rating, the studio tried to bury it, and it saved them anyway, grossing over $9 million on a $1 million budget. The production began just months after the Tate LaBianca murders, and the sword-wielding climax in a Hollywood Hills mansion felt close enough to recent reality that the studio was briefly terrified of being seen as profiting from a cultural wound they hadn't caused. Eddie Williams, who plays the film's most outrageously drawn Hollywood sexpot, married Russ Meyer the same year it was released, then spent the following decade arriving at the Academy Awards in increasingly elaborate outfits as a personal protest against an industry that refused to take her seriously, which is a perfectly calibrated response to having starred in a film that Roger Ebert spent decades quietly defending against everyone who mocked him for writing it. Phyllis Davis spent time on a Costa Rican plantation filming a scene where her character seduces a live puma to avoid being mauled, on a production that had no plan for what happens if the puma disagrees, which is a reasonable summary of how Sweet Sugar approaches everything. The film is a women in prison movie where the prison is a sugar plantation, the warden moonlights as a mad scientist running experiments on inmates, and a voodoo subplot arrives halfway through without explanation and never fully leaves. None of it connects the way it should, and the film does not care, building toward an armed uprising that feels less like a climax and more like the natural result of everything that came before it. The Women in Prison label attached itself to Davis immediately and made it nearly impossible to get cast in anything else, and she spent years fighting back into mainstream television before landing Vegas. A decade later, after she had rebuilt her career into a recognizable name on primetime television through Vegas, a direct-to-video compilation called Famous TNA recycled unedited footage of her nude scenes from the film as a primary selling point, exploiting her newfound fame to sell her older work back to audiences who had just learned her name, which is a precise account of what the exploitation circuit was willing to do to the people who built it. To film in the neighborhoods of late 70s New York City, the production of The Warriors hired a real gang called the Mongrels for $500 a day to protect the equipment, and it still wasn't enough. The film is set in a version of New York where every gang dresses in a theme costume. The baseball furies play baseball in full face paint, the orphans look like they got lost on the way to a school play, and all of this is played completely straight without a single wink at the audience, which is exactly what makes it work. The actors were instructed never to wear their vests off set because they were regularly challenged to actual fights by locals, and a rival gang destroyed a set after being excluded from the $500 arrangement. When the film opened in February of 1979, fatal stabbings and shootings occurred outside multiple theaters. Paramount pulled all advertising and replaced the gang wall poster with a simple logo. The film grossed $22 million on a $4 million budget, and Walter Hill was blamed for glamorizing gang culture anyway. Arnold Schwarzenegger took a $250,000 role in The Villain because he needed to prove he could do comedy, and the finished film nearly convinced Hollywood he couldn't do anything at all. The Villain is Hollywood spending $10 million to make a live-action Looney Tunes cartoon where Kirk Douglas falls off cliffs, gets flattened by boulders, and consults a literal instruction manual for villains. And the entire joke is that he fails every single time, while Schwarzenegger wanders through the film, too dim-witted to notice any of it happening. Douglas performed most of his own slapstick stunts at 62, including being launched by a rubber band harness that malfunctioned and nearly sent him into a rock face, a story he later told with something close to fondness, and he reportedly loved the physical punishment in a way that terrified the studio's insurance department. Schwarzenegger was so embarrassed by the finished product that he rarely mentioned it during his rise in the 80s, treating it as a professional event he had survived rather than participated in, until James Cameron handed him The Terminator, and the question became irrelevant. The film cost nearly $10 million and grossed roughly $3 million. And the production's horse, Whiskey, received the only strong notices, with the Los Angeles Times writing that the horse was the only one on set who understood the joke, which was not intended as a compliment to the humans. Sean Connery agreed to wear a red loincloth and thigh-high boots in front of a 30-foot flying stone head because he needed the work, and director John Borman could not find a single other person willing to read the script. Zardoz is set in 2293, features Connery crawling out of a stone god's mouth to discover a commune of immortal intellectuals, so bored with eternal life that they have started welcoming death as a gift. Burt Reynolds had been cast in the lead, read the script, and dropped out sick the week before filming began, which is how Connery ended up announced as the replacement with cameras already about to roll. The production was so underfunded that Connery drove himself to set to save money, stayed at the director's family house, paid rent to Borman's wife, and still had to wear both the red loincloth and a wedding dress. Connery said the finished film was a disaster. Fox executives asked Borman if there was a version with a plot, and the film has been screening at universities continuously for 50 years, which is a strange place for something everyone agreed was unwatchable to end up.